This podcast is produced by On.Pod, a video content studio near you.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Today we're here with Lyson. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Lyson, before we dive in, can you tell us a bit about your background and how you came to be an expert in Indigenous relations?
For sure. I started really by coincidence. I moved to Ottawa to study international development, and I got into the co-op program. One of my internships during the program happened to be in what was back then INAC, which is now Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada. So I started working, really looking at old documents and taking a lot of notes on the negotiation of what are called specific claims. So they're actually negotiations between the Government of Canada and First Nations where Canada didn't really respect treaty promises that it made or other legal obligations that it had towards First Nations. And that's when I realized that so much still had to be done in Indigenous relations and towards reconciliation in Canada. After that first internship, I was able to join the department after my studies and ended up working in the negotiation of future-looking agreement this time, those being called modern treaties and self-government agreements. So some really interesting discussions talking about Indigenous self-determination and really Indigenous groups reclaiming their power and their jurisdictions. After I worked on the negotiation of those agreements, I was curious to see what happens after the negotiation. As negotiators, we tend to think that the finish line is when we sign the negotiation. That's how we measure progress in negotiations. But when it comes to Indigenous relations and those types of future-looking agreements, the signing of an agreement is really just the beginning of a new relationship between the Crown and those Indigenous groups. So I moved on to an organization called the Implementation Sector. And over there, I moved around a little bit and ended up joining a team where we developed and delivered training to public servants across the Government of Canada to help them better understand and be aware of modern treaties and self-governance agreements. So in under 2 years, we ended up delivering our training to over 10,000 people. And I really caught the bug for training then. And that has led me to then make a big jump outside of the public service and join Indigenous corporate training where I'm at now, where I'm able to deliver Indigenous relations training to a much wider audience.
Okay, that's amazing. So you started out looking at all these negotiations and you saw that it wasn't really working. The government didn't do anything. And then you realized after that after the negotiation is signed, there's no guarantee that they're going to follow through, right? Is that where the training comes in, or?
I mean, there are legal obligations, but it's hard to respect legal obligations that you're not aware of.
Okay.
And governments are such huge machines that really more needs to be done to educate public servants about their responsibilities towards Indigenous groups and to better understand how these things work. It's one of the calls to actions from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2015 was to increase education of public servants when it comes to awareness and understanding of the history in our country, really.
Okay, let's talk about the Indian Act now. For those who aren't familiar with it, what is it and what's the main idea behind it?
Okay, so the Indian Act is one of the oldest piece of legislation that we have in Canada. It's only a few years younger than Canada itself. It will be turning 150 years old next year in 2026. It was passed in 1876. And the goal of the Indian Act was really to control pretty much every aspect of the lives of First Nations people in Canada. So it looked at three main areas of control, one being governance, one being lands, and the other one being citizenship or membership. Who gets to call themselves First Nations or a status Indian under the Indian Act?
Mm-hmm. Okay, that history is difficult but essential for understanding right now. You also mentioned the Indian Act created an unjust system. What are some of the most common issues created that persist today? Because 1850, oh my God, that's that's a long time for this act to be. I'm sure it's gone through a lot of transformations.
It has gone through a lot of change. There is still a ton of work to do to fix some of the inequalities and issues with the Indian Act. One of the big issues that we see with Indian Act bans is the land question, because First Nations are on reserve lands, and reserve lands are technically federal crown lands. So if you are a First Nation person and you buy a house on a reserve, you can own the house, but you cannot own the land under the house. You're just leasing that from the Canadian government, which means it's really challenging to get a mortgage because the bank can't hold the house and the land it sits on as collateral. It also causes issues because nobody on the reserve owns the land. So if you want to have a business come in and build a new shopping center or lease a building, who has to sign the lease? It's actually the Minister of Indigenous Services Canada.
So the government has to do that.
Yes. And I'm sure you can imagine how long it takes to get a federal minister to sign off on anything. Now imagine that multiplied by hundreds of reserves in Canada.
Yeah, that leaves a pit in my stomach. That's like, oh my goodness, you can't even sell the land. Anyway, okay.
One of the issues too, not directly a result of the Indian Act, but very much intertwined with that, is historic treaties. So historic treaties were signed between 1701 and 1923 in Canada. They cover most of Ontario and the prairies. When we think of historic treaties, we speak especially of the numbered treaties, which are those in Ontario and the prairies. Canada signed those treaties to get access and, in their view, ownership of the lands that First Nations lived on and took care of before that. In exchange, they promised a number of things, including farm equipment that we call cows and plows, sometimes education on reserves, teacher salaries to be paid for by the government, things like that, and a treaty annuity, which is a payment that was to be made by the government to each individual member of a First Nation in exchange for that transaction that happened, letting settlers use the lands. Now, at those times, most of those treaties promised $4 or $5 per member per year. It had a certain buying power at the time. There weren't any provisions to update that amount. Inflation wasn't even a concept that we spoke about at the time. It wasn't a concept that was understood back then. Mm-hmm. So to this day, in 2025, you have federal Crown officials going around the country to First Nations communities and urban centers every summer. Usually the season is July, August for Treaty Days, and they hand out 2 toonies or 1 crisp $5 bill to every First Nation member who's the beneficiary of a historic treaty who comes to get their treaty annuity. Wow.
That's crazy. So is that what reconciliation is about, to change all of these concepts? Like, one, if you have a house, you need to be able to own and sell the land under it as well. And 2, like trying to fix all this, like inflation, so it's not so much as a slap in the face, if I may say, to do that. What are some positive changes that you're seeing that does give you hope from the future? And if you could give some examples of a policy shift or initiative that is making a real difference.
Mm-hmm. For sure. So reconciliation is partly about that. It's also about more than that.
For sure.
Most people are shocked to learn these things. There is still a lot to be done to educate Canadians and educate ourselves about really the history of Canada and the reality of Indigenous peoples in Canada to this day. There are a lot of changes that have been done. There are more to be done. Now, in our training, we often hear, well, if the Indian Act is so bad, why is it still in place 150 years later? Can't we just get rid of it? And the answer is yes, but not that easily. People have tried, in 1969, Trudeau father has actually, his government put forward what was then called the White Paper, which was a policy proposal to get rid of the Indian Act, get rid of Indian status, get rid of reserves, get rid of treaties, and Indigenous peoples in Canada would be equal to every other Canadian. Now, first of all, that was done without enough consultation of Indigenous leaders at the time, the people who would be most impacted by those policy changes. Mm-hmm. It faced a lot of backlash and opposition, and in the end was scrapped. What Indigenous leaders and others saw this as was actually the ultimate attempt at assimilation. It was removing anything and everything that recognizes the distinct nature of First Nations in Canada. No longer recognized as status Indian, no longer reserves, no more treaty promises. It was seen as an attempt to just completely give up and default, really, on promises that had been made to First Nations. Mm-hmm. Now, over 50 years later, many Indigenous groups are reclaiming their power through self-government agreements, modern treaties, but that has to be done on a case-by-case basis. Not every Indigenous group is ready to take on full governance back and have to deal with not just their own governance, but addressing the gaps and issues created by over a century of assimilation policies. So it's not the government's role to come in and make, again, a unilateral decision and impose it on First Nations. What we need to do is create option and make space for Indigenous groups to reclaim their power and their decisions when they are ready for that.
For sure. So speaking of Indigenous consultation, we have heard a lot of criticism from Indigenous groups recently about federal and provincial governments' initiatives to fast track certain nation building projects. Why is that?
Very good question. On one hand, it is a bit of a break with the progress that we have seen in the past 10 years on involving Indigenous groups much earlier in policy and legal developments. Involving them from the very design phase. Now, the why over specifically why these fast tracking legislation are being criticized, in large parts, they do away or seek to streamline or get around processes like the environmental impact assessment that traditionally have served to do Indigenous consultation. So if we get rid of the meeting room where we do Indigenous consultation, what guarantees do we have that it will actually happen, even though it is still a legal obligation? And if it doesn't happen, then Indigenous groups are faced with the choice of either being put on the sidelines and seeing their rights being impacted and infringed upon, or suing the governments and potentially having to get the courts to put a stop to those projects that are being fast-tracked because Indigenous consultation wasn't done properly.
Wow, there's a lot of bureaucracy with the government, eh?
Always.
Oh my goodness, yeah, this process is... what can Canadians do to contribute to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples?
What can Canadians do? Learn. Keep learning, really. There is so much that we don't know, that people around us don't know. Commit to learning, listening to Indigenous voices, watching Indigenous shows, reading Indigenous books, engaging with Indigenous peoples. Go to a powwow, go see some art, watch an Indigenous show that you like. Get to hear those stories and those perspectives told by Indigenous people, as opposed to the stories about them being told by others.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I feel like a lot of the stuff that we don't know about all of this Indigenous peoples, the way the government handles things, the way negotiation goes, it's almost like taboo to talk about these really main issues that are kind of, I don't know. Would you give advice or a way to kind of be able to speak about that without thinking that it's going to be censored or is too taboo at that point? Or do you just recommend leaving that voice to the Indigenous peoples because they're the only ones that have that perspective? What's your input on that?
It's a balance to strike. Things for and about Indigenous peoples should be done by Indigenous peoples, or at the very least informed by Indigenous peoples. But then again, these days, every organization wants to hire a large number of Indigenous peoples, and they want Indigenous individuals in senior leadership roles, and they want Indigenous peoples in school, and they want them in Indigenous Advisory Council. And at this time, it seems to me like there is a need for non-Indigenous people in those spaces too. You need to be humble and acknowledge the gaps in your perspectives and in your knowledge, and listen and be open to and receptive to opinions and perspectives and advice that you get from Indigenous peoples. But this is not something that can be done only by Indigenous peoples. White people were part of the problem too, and I think we need to be part of the solution as well.
For sure. Okay. Now, negotiating and regulating. What are the most difficult aspects of negotiating agreements between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian government based on your experience?
Based on my experience, and this is echoed by other negotiators I've worked with as well, the hardest part of those negotiations is actually the negotiations that happen in the background when you've gone to the negotiation table, you have pretty much agreement at the table, and you need to go back inside the government system and convince the internal players. Negotiators in Indigenous relations are often the biggest advocates of Indigenous peoples within the system they work in. So speaking with the Government of Finance, speaking with the Department of Justice, speaking with Treasury Board, those are the hardest discussions, not the negotiation meetings with Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, there's a lot of people you got to go through. You got to convince every single one of them. It's like a jury almost, right?
And there's a lack of awareness and understanding, which is often the issue that we run into.
Right. Which challenges in regulating modern treaties and land campaigns present the toughest obstacles for fair and effective outcomes?
Okay. Very pointed question. Some of the biggest challenges I see with modern treaties these days, and again, I might sound like a broken record, but has to do with a lack of awareness. Modern treaties are a very unique regulatory and legal environment. And when decision makers and policy makers don't have the knowledge of how they work within the legal and regulatory system, it can leave gaps that are can be quite critical and are not intended. One example of that is the 2023 wildfires in Northwest Territory. In Northwest Territories, you have modern treaties there. When communities were being evacuated, Clecho government leaders were in conference calls with politicians and bureaucrats at different levels of governments, especially the federal government, trying to figure out how to get emergency management support funding to their community. Because in other places, if there was an emergency in Ottawa, let's say, public safety, the Department of Public Safety would have support for that. But because we're talking about Indigenous groups, public safety said, well, that falls under Indigenous Services Canada. Now, Indigenous Services Canada focuses on reserve when it comes to land management and things like that. So their program excluded groups that have modern treaties, since after a modern treaty, typically you don't have reserves anymore. The land changes title.
Okay.
So they couldn't get funding from public safety, and they couldn't get funding from Indigenous Services Canada, and their community was being evacuated. And because Indigenous governments are a very special type of government, they were not fully considered like an order of government, like federal, provincial, or municipal. So they were stuck in this really weird black hole, and legislative gap that left their community in a really tough situation in times of need. And this only came to light during an emergency when there were wildfires around.
Yeah, I think that brings it back to the lack of awareness too. Like, if you are looking at that from an outsider perspective, it's probably hard to see exactly what everybody is going through and why they're going through that. And it's probably extremely easy to throw projections out there and try to fill in those gaps with stuff that you think you know, but you don't know. And with that being said, before I want you to point out these books as well, because this is something that I would like to know more about, things you may not know about the Indian Act. Because, yeah, there's so many things that,
I can open it.
Okay, sure. Yeah, that we think we may know. That's okay.
Here.
Yeah, well,
There.
Can the camera see? Yeah, there we go. Read this book, everybody. Yeah.
These two, those are a few of my favorite books. If you don't know where to start in Indigenous relations, you want to learn more about reconciliation. Actually, September 30th, National Truth and Reconciliation Day is coming up in Canada. It's a great opportunity to try and learn more about Indigenous relations. Those are some of the books that I would recommend. So number one, 21 Things About the Indian Act. Here, I can put it. No, hold on. This camera.
Yeah, there. That's good. That's good.
21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act by Bob Joseph. If you don't care to read the Indian Act itself, although I recommend people do it, this is a great overview of some of the really unfair things that the Indian Act put in place, some of which are still in place today. Bob's newest book has a bit more of a positive outlook and is actually about Indigenous self-government, about Indigenous groups reclaiming their power and dismantling the Indian Act for their community in their own way. So really interesting book. If you are a bit of the nerdy type like me, or you are a lawyer, I would recommend Indigenous Rights in 1 Minute by Bruce McIver. It goes over some case law in Aboriginal law, as well as common questions on Indigenous rights. What I love about Bruce's book is that each chapter is 1 page or 1.5 page. The answers are really, really short and concise. And then if you want something that is action oriented, I would recommend David Robertson's 52 Ways to Reconcile. You can make a little plan of action for the year ahead, and every week take one concrete action to contribute to reconciliation.
Beautiful. We need actions around here, right? And I feel like that's a good place to start because I cannot do law. I'm bad at reading legal jargon. So I think that's a really great place to kind of dive in and
concrete.
Yeah, really figure out what's going on. So thank you so much for being here, Lyson, and answering all these questions. I'm sure you have to deal with a lot of burden every day, but thank you for enlightening us today.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.